Joining me this week is Dr. Sascha Heckmann. Sascha is currently the Assistant Superintendent for Innovation and Learning at the American School Foundation in Monterrey, Mexico. Previously, Sascha was Director of the American International School in Mozambique. He was also a high school principal at the Shanghai American School, and prior to that, he worked at various schools throughout California. Sascha is the co-author of the book Personalized Learning in a PLC at Work, and he is the co-founder of 8 Degrees Up, which is a group dedicated to helping students own their futures by owning their learning. I first met Sascha at a PLC conference held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So it is great to reconnect with him today. Sascha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Fun fact, listeners, one of the highlights of that conference in Ethiopia, besides the conference, of course, all the learning we did, was the fantastic Oktoberfest. Surprisingly, the fantastic Oktoberfest, Sascha, that we attended at the hotel. And you had commented to me at the time when we were there that it was one of the best Oktoberfests you've ever been to, and surprising to be in Ethiopia that we did that.
For sure. I have a little street cred on that as well, because I'm German heritage. I've been to a few Oktoberfests. And so, no, it was fantastic. The food was good. The pretzels were amazing, and the beers were big. So that's never a bad thing.
Never a bad thing. And yes, I am German as well in heritage, but I don't know that I have the same Oktoberfest pedigree that you do. But it just shows you that where there's a will, there's a way. You can create a great Oktoberfest anywhere. So let's jump in right now, because I think we got a lot to explore and a lot to talk about. And I want to start with the arc of your career. I mentioned some of the highlights of where you've been, but maybe fill in some of the missing pieces for us and highlight your professional journey that kind of led you to becoming an author, a keynote speaker, and really considered an expert in personalized learning.
Yeah, I mean, I have a windy road, I guess I'd say. I mean, I wasn't going to be a teacher to begin with. I was going to be an attorney, much like many first generation college kids. You're supposed to go to something technical, but I fell in love with school, and I started my career working with really at-risk kids, kids coming out of California Youth Authority or kids on their way to California Youth Authority. And that was really a great experience, seeing the impact education can have on transforming lives, and really got me invested. Social studies teacher by trade, soccer coach, of course, German backgrounds, coached a bit of football. And so then I got into administration kind of by a tap on the shoulder, like many of us do. I really enjoyed teaching, and I was having a lot of success with at-risk kids. And my principal said, "Hey, we kind of have a school-wide at-risk kid problem. So can you help us close this achievement gap?" So that really became my passions work is really achievement gap work and equity work in public schools in California. I was very proud to see a school get out of federal sanctions. We were in program improvement at the time, is what they called it. And we were able to exit by really making a big difference for kids that were at risk, or as I like to say, at promise. And so then that kind of, as happens when you have a lot of success, gives you a little bit of rocket boost forward. And I was a principal in California. And then somewhere along that journey, we're having also a lot of success, but I had my own family, my own kids, and my wife. I'd always wanted to do something different. So that took us abroad. And so that's when I went to Shanghai American School, which was a fascinating experience working in China. At a American school where we're doing American curriculum work with all expats, but also, it's my first time, I would say, where I was working exclusively with a privileged group of kids, and seeing kind of some of the learning challenges being the same. So in the United States, I was always about, hey, this problem is really economic, it's poverty based, it's those things, but really maybe it's not, maybe it's system based, and maybe it's of how we educate kids. And that was kind of the inspiration of looking at agency. And why do we do education to kids? Why isn't education happening with kids or by kids? And then I met Dr. Tim Stewart at a conference. I heard him speak, and he was one of the few people talking about the same things I was talking about. And I'm like, hey, we should probably get together and like amplify our voice and do something together. And that's when we launched the book project, Personalized Learning. Both of us are big believers in the PLC process, how it can transform schools. And we thought it was a very powerful way to transform the experience of kids. So that led to the book. And luckily we had Mike Matos and Austin Buffum who gave us an ear, and it was like, yeah, that's really interesting. Let's think about that together. And then from there, it's just gone forward. And so each place I've been, I went to school in Africa, and I worked in the IB program, which is really about agency and inquiry. That was really fascinating to see that lens, yet it's still incredibly institutional with a lot of rules and procedures and compliance metrics and all of those things that we all deal with as educators. And then now I'm in Mexico, and my job is to kind of work on the system and try to get us to do a better job with kids in the classrooms. And so I really enjoyed that. Going from being a superintendent where you're working externally a lot, I'm really enjoying working internally with our faculty. So that's been my journey. And I've had an opportunity of people giving me chances to speak, and I've taken those as they've come. And this last week I was at the RTI Summit in Austin. That was a fantastic experience, working with over 1,000 public school educators, and so I'm really enjoying that. And that seems to be more and more direction that way, which is amazing opportunity to kind of influence education on a grander scale, with beyond my school building. So I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah,
that's kind of the journey.
It's been certainly a fascinating journey, and I have certainly over the last decade have had the good fortune of working with overseas international schools quite a bit, and have been just really enthralled and fascinated by the whole international school scene, and funny how small a world that is. So I want to take a bit of a tangent here, listeners. You may recall, longtime listeners will remember I had Tim Stewart on the podcast in the fall of 2020. This is Sascha is Tim's business partner, and they work together and they co-author, etc. But many listeners are likely intrigued, Sascha, by your overseas experience, and maybe wondering how they can do that. So from your perspective, I'd like to ask you two things about overseas teaching before we dig into personalized learning. First, what drew you to international education? What was it? How did you hear about it? How did you become familiar with it? And I've got a second follow-up question, but first, what was it about international education that just sort of caught your attention?
Well, I mean, pragmatically, there was some real pragmatics. My wife had always wanted to do it. I didn't know anything about it, to be honest. My wife had wanted to go abroad, and she was doing a 5-year plan in California, and I met her in year 4 and kind of ruined her plans, as sometimes happens, when you meet someone. And so she still had this urge, and I'd become a principal. We had our 2 kids. My son was just born, and we were working a lot, and frankly, not getting ahead very much financially. And it was really difficult in California. We're both working educators, and we can't buy a house. That was our reality. And my wife's like, we should do this thing. And I said, I'm a little bit of a cynic. I could be from Missouri, show me. And so I said, there's no way someone's going to pay me a full US salary and cover my housing, and I get to live in an amazing exotic place. And she's like, no, it's real. So I went and checked it out, and it was. And basically, international schools, or U.S. public schools abroad, typically started by and supported by the State Department for diplomats and expats living abroad. They're U.S. accredited. I always get are you teaching English to foreigners? No, that's not what we're doing. We're running a comprehensive high school with sports programs and AP programs and IB programs and all of that. And it's very transferable. And so once we found out, it's a small little black box of how you get into the system. And so, we figured that out, and I applied to Shanghai, and I was fortunate enough to get that position. At the time, I didn't realize it was such a prestigious position, because I was running a school of 2,700 kids, and my high school at Shanghai was 700. It didn't seem at the same scale, but then you realize the reputation of the school once you're there, and you're like, oh, I got a good job out of this deal. So I've been very fortunate to travel that circuit, and they're basically private schools that are loosely affiliated, right, through the State Department, typically. But yeah, they're great schools, and really interesting kids who have different perspectives on the world, and it's fun work. But it's hard work, just like U.S. public schools is hard work. It's the same work, but with different kids in different places.
For sure. I think you and I just missed each other, because it was March of 2012 when I did a 2-day assessment training at Shanghai American School, and I think you were hired in the summer. You started in that following fall of 2012. So we could have met a lot sooner had the timing worked out a little bit differently. So here's my follow-up question. Those who are listening right now, thinking about, they're intrigued by it, or they've always wondered, I wonder what it would be like to teach overseas, but I don't know how to go about doing it. How do I find out? What is the best way for educators who are interested in teaching internationally? What's the best way for them to go about at least exploring or finding out, what the possibilities are for them?
Well, first, if you're listening to this and you're an agency in personalized learning, contact me, because I'm always looking for good educators at my school. So I'll do a little shameless plug there to contact me. No, but there's a couple of recruitment agencies that kind of dominate the environment. One's called Search Associates, and the other one's International School Services, ISS, and they kind of dominate the placements. So most of us work with those recruitment agencies. There's a long-time recruitment fair at University of Northern Iowa, go figure, Northern Iowa, that has done a lot of placements. If you're Canadian, Queens has had a long history of placing teachers abroad. So our school uses all 4 of those services to find teachers. And so that's the entry point. And really what most schools are looking for is teachers with at least 3 years of public school experience, with some background. And then from there, it's depending on the school, they have different criteria. But yeah, I would reach out to those agencies, and they're the place to start. They have kind of the monopoly on the marketplace when it comes to teacher placement, because we just, I'm recruiting teachers from all over the world, so it's difficult for us to have a network.
Right.
If you find a school you like, you can always direct apply, but I think the recruitment agencies are probably the best step.
Okay. And one last question about that very quickly before we dive into other content. Sounds very glamorous, working in China, Mexico, Africa, et cetera. There's a lot of glamour associated with working overseas. What are one or two things that people would have to be prepared for when working overseas that they may not be thinking of when they're distracted by this sort of the highlights of being able to travel the world? What are some things that people need to prepare themselves for when they think about working overseas?
I think professionally, the biggest thing is that people have this notion that I get all this autonomy when you go abroad, and because you're leaving kind of the notion of state mandates and so forth. Well, when you go work at a private school, the parent mandates are as intense or more intense than that. So there's still a lot of pressure and accountability in a more tangible way than maybe you expect. And also, I think early people were leaving schools from standards and trying to get that autonomy. And all the schools I've worked are U.S. standards aligned, and so standards-based education is here to stay. Professionally, I think you have to be really open-minded. You can't be seeking to recreate America someplace else. You have to be willing to embrace local cultures and really understand things from a different perspective. And you have to be an inquirer. You have to be willing to go, because I've seen people, well, it's not like it was back home. Well, yeah, you're in China. That's true. Right. I mean, that seems obvious, but it's strange when you go to an American school and that things don't work the same way. And if you haven't traveled a lot and seen a lot, that can be a little disruptive. And so you can definitely have that challenge. But that open-mindedness is, I think, the key to really finding success abroad.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so let's jump in. I want to focus on student agency and personalized learning. We hear that phrase a lot. Student agency is thrown around quite a bit today, but I often see different interpretations of what that ultimately means. So, from your perspective, let's just start with basically what is student agency from your perspective, and how do we cultivate that in our schools?
Well, I think for us, we've defined student agency as students' ability to take specific and purposeful action to advance their level of success. And we take that straight from the dictionary when you start looking at what agency really means. And so we try not to overcomplicate it. We want to use kind of common nomenclature, because I think in education as authors, we often create new terms for lots of reasons. I try to avoid that as much as possible. The other thing that I think is really large for us is kids have it. They already have it. Whether you're talking about a baby who's putting things in their mouth, whether you're talking about my son who's in fourth grade that just learned how to play a video game online, they have it. Kids know how to learn. They already have agency. The question is, do we allow them to bring that into the classroom? And so for us, what we talk about a lot is the expression of agency. Do the kids have the skills, the dispositions, and the mindsets to really express agency in your environment? And what are you doing as an educator to leverage agency, to amplify that? Because kids bring that resource to your classroom already. So why do we assume they don't know how to learn? Why do we assume that they're empty, as opposed to being really rich beings that bring a lot of creativity and knowledge and background into the classroom? So we want to create environments where kids can express agency. And then that way, for us, what we talk about when we think about social justice, being inclusive, having a culturally responsive classroom, the best way to do that is allow kids to bring their authentic experiences into the classroom and leverage those for their learning. And so we really emphasize that we don't want kids to take a common route to get to the end, but we got to get them through the end, right? And I say through the end because the standards are not our goal at our schools. They're the floor. This is what we need kids to know. They should know so much more. And so we have to get them through those standards. And so that target has to be common, but how we arrive and go through that target doesn't have to be the same. And that's what agency allows us to do, is allows us to honor kids. And so we would say personalized learning occurs when kids are able to express agency in our environment. So one of the big differences for us, when I've looked at differentiation movement, I've looked at individualized learning, all of these movements, is this notion again that education is happening to kids. We're doing it to them, so to speak, as opposed to they're learning and they're doing it for themselves. And so if we want to personalize that, how do you personalize? You make it your own, right? That's what it means to personalize. Anything that's personal is to me. It has value to me. And so we have to create an environment in classrooms where kids can find meaning in the space, find meaning in the learning, and then connect to it really authentically, that honors who they are as learners and moves them through that experience. So that's a challenge, because it means that you can't be the teacher that's designing lessons. It doesn't mean you can't be curriculum focused. You have to be student focused. And I think that's the biggest transition we're seeking, is that let's amplify agency by honoring who our kids are and what they bring naturally to the classroom. But some of our longstanding practices work really well in that environment. So you don't have to give up everything. It's not doing everything new. It's just taking a different look or different perspective on your existing practice that really moves you forward.
You bring up an interesting point. I've never quite heard it expressed that way. That when and I use the word cultivate, and I think there's a connotation to that word that we have to develop it, and the idea that students come to school already with it, that they have the agency, they already have those skills, and really it's just a matter of us getting out of the way in some respects, that we don't over control the environment and over prescribe the environment and allow students. I've never quite thought of it that way. That's a really great point. Now, I think it's the balance, right? Because they do have to have some skills, and we do have to understand how to. Where do you think that comes from? Why do you think teachers at times feel like they need to over control the environment with students? Is it a behavioral thing? Is it a learning thing? Is it a little bit of both? What do you think? Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I mean, I'm a social scientist by trade, so I think schools have a history and a culture that we are often not aware of. There's a lot of implicit biases in schools. So, I mean,
Hmm.
let's talk about why schools were created, right? Schools were created as a reflection of the industrial economy, and so accuracy and repetition was really the goal, right? It sounds really terrible to say, but the goal is to create factory workers that can do things for a long period of time accurately with high endurance.
Right.
And then what we were always selecting and sorting forever, and the kids that were the kind of the top were the ones that got to go be the engineers, be the white collar, and that worked. 50s, 60s, 70s, that was a fantastic model for learning. The other thing that's changed dramatically is information access, right? The
Hmm.
internet is the game changer. I mean, so our kids are fact checking us now, right? So if you're teaching 1978 facts, because that's when you were trained and that's when you learned things, then kids are going on the internet and saying, well, that's not true anymore, miss or mister,
Hmm.
right? Like, and so then we lose credibility with our kids because they have access to information. So for 100 years, we had more information than our kids. That's not the case anymore, and kids know it. I mean, if you have an eighth grader or below, they've been around since the iPad was invented, right? I mean, I saw a kid, I joke, but I saw a kid the other day stand in front of their teachers and do this, right? Swipe, I'm looking for the next video. This is not working for me, right? So that's kind of
Hmm.
a feedback signal that maybe the lesson's not working.
Right.
And so, but we also have to acknowledge that education for years has been a static industry. We could do the same
Hmm.
thing for 30 years. What's the old saying? Are we teaching the same year 30 times, or have we taught for
Right.
30 years? Right. I mean, that's a real thing. It's a truism. And so
Hmm.
we have to change as fast as the environment. So part of that is, Paulo Freire, Brazilian researcher in education, says, are we educating for conformity or educating for liberation? And I think, a lot of times we educate for conformity. And what I've seen being in a non-private schools is what I worry about, honestly, is that public schools has become the new conformity mechanism for the masses. Because when you go to private schools and you visit them, they're not doing the stuff we're doing in public schools.
Hmm.
Kids, they're doing Socratic dialogues, Harkness table, PBL. Like, the kids have a lot of choice, right? So in some ways, what we see when people opt out of the public school system is they're opting out of an industrial model of education. But then
Hmm.
think about scale and all of those things, right? I mean, my public school had 2,700 kids. So there's a scale factor there. We're just designed for this. So I don't blame the educators. It's the system we were trained in, the system we all
Right.
benefited from. There's a sociology about it that it was good for us. It's good for them. There's a sociology about it. So all of those
Hmm.
factors require us to do some deep introspection about how the kids are
Hmm.
different now than how they used to be,
Right.
right? And that they're not empty, right? And I
That's
can
right.
think about the teachers that inspired me. They didn't treat me as I was empty, right? I remember
Hmm.
Miss Sweeten, immigrant kid, didn't speak English. She saw in me the ability to learn. Mr. Haggard, who taught me how to write in grade 10, was like, wow, you have a lot to say. You have a voice. You're just not
Hmm.
saying it very well. Let me teach you how to put some words around that will really give you voice. But he saw I had a voice. He didn't think of me as having no voice. So I
Right.
think great teachers have been doing this for a long time. I think
Sure.
the system has to kind of catch up to the rest of us.
Yeah, I think everybody shares some responsibility in all of that for sure. I think some
Sure.
of it is the behavioral side of it. Some of it is the I need to cover my standards at a
For sure.
rapid pace. All of those different things sort of factor into that. But I love that notion that they come to us with that agency, and it's almost as if the system kind of beats it out of them and turns them. But again, there's no caricature or no extreme position that's ever right. It's not. There has to be some order, there has to be some consistency or predictability, but everything in balance, and finding ways to cultivate that in schools for sure. In the book, and I mentioned this to Tim as well when I talked to him, the book about PLC at work, personalized learning in a PLC at work, something you all did, Tim, you, Mike, Austin, yourself, that I thought was very clever was turning the 4 guiding questions of a PLC into first-person questions for the students. I thought that was a really great framework. Just a brilliant structure to kind of bring and cultivate that agency. But at the same time, as simple as those questions appear, a lot of teachers could feel very overwhelmed by starting to shift those practices. So if they wanted to use those 4 guiding questions to cultivate student agency in their classrooms, where should they begin? What's the best way to begin with that?
Well, I think it depends on your perspective. When we wrote the book, we talked about question 4, right? So those kids that already have the standards, let's release them and let them go deeper and find more challenge and ask them where they think they could go further in the learning. And that's really a powerful tool if you're working in a PLC school where you're really focused on common assessments and you're working as a team. And so differentiating there. As an individual practitioner, there's access points everywhere to do this work. So whether you're talking about asking kids to look at the learning outcomes around question 1 and saying, what does this mean to you? What do you already know? And doing some diagnostic assessments for them to self-reflect on their entry points to the learning. So, the old KWL chart, right? What do you know about this already? That's a really powerful tool to let kids really express what they already know and give them room in the classroom to have different starting points as opposed to saying lesson 1, lesson 2. You work a lot on assessment. What about goal setting and success criteria development, letting kids be part of that process and really opening that up and having a dialogue and modeling. Like when I see this is what I see as proficient. What do you guys see? And having that dialogue and opening up the dialogue about what it means to be successful in the learning. Support structures. I mean, Doug Fisher does a great process on modeling and misconceptions and how we teach kids to question their own work and identify their own sources of support. So the entry points are many places. So I think that as a practitioner, you have to know where you're ready and where's your entry point. And so if you're I call you a curriculum head. If you like the written curriculum a lot, start there. Open up the written curriculum. If you're passionate about portfolio assessment, you're passionate about giving kids voice over how they're graded, start there. If you're a learning support teacher and you love having kids build independence and resources, start there. I mean, if you're someone who's like, what do I do with the 5 kids who always seem to finish first? Well, then start there. I think everybody has different classroom challenges, and so it's really about switching that language in the classroom to saying, so what is it you think you can do next that really is the shift fundamentally, and honoring the learners. And their strategies. I think the hardest part is we're not trained this way. I mean, I wasn't trained in inquiry for sure, right? I mean, if you look at a fellow Canadian like Trevor McKenzie, who's like going around like crazy talking about inquiry by design and some of the stuff he's doing, Kath Murdoch. I mean, we're just not trained this way. So like we're trained whole group instruction. If we got differentiation and we're good at that, wow, we'd be a superstar teacher in most schools. So we have to lean into all those practices of workshopping, small groups, differentiated tasks in a real meaningful way. And so I always tell teachers the place to start is your design. If you design for agency and you think about, okay, here's a point where I can give kids choice and design for it, because that gets kids more invested and owned in the experience. And then suddenly you'll see them behave differently. Because I think one of the tensions we have right now is, the pandemic has done something really interesting. It's given kids the off button. And I think we got really offended as educators. The kids were turning their screens off. They weren't coming to school, but they suddenly were able to mute us. Right. And that didn't happen in the classroom. And I think instead of being offended, we should reflect, like, why are they muting us? What's going on with that? Why are they not interested in what we're doing? And why and do that inquiry. Like, what around this? And there's something to be said. I always tell my kids grinding, I'm a child of the 90s hip hop scene. So I like grinding. I always tell my kids, sometimes you got to do things you don't like and you got to grind through it. You just got to, that's part of that persistence, that determination, that part of it is a mindset we have to build in kids for sure. But asking them, like, which part of this do you think you're gonna have to grind through and which part of this inspires you? That's a starting point. Give the kids a voice and they're gonna come into your room more inspired because they know you care about them individually. So those are all entry points, but the techniques are challenging for teachers, I think, to acquire, because we've been trained, like, start a lesson, anticipatory set, right? Give them keep them busy, keep them moving. The GRR model did a great job of, like, I do, we do, you do. That's great. And transferring some ownership. We actually lean into that when we talk about how teachers should lean into agency is start with I do, model the behaviors, model the questioning, model those things, and then slowly start giving kids more room to express themselves.
Yeah. I think that idea of there are things you have to grind through is really important for teachers to keep in mind, because as much as we personalize the learning and try to nurture curiosity and push students in that way, they're not going to have a passion for everything. all the time. And so
That's right.
we have to, there are times where we have to, there are certain things that are going to be required, certain things they have to do. But I think in most cases you can find, if you're open to it, you can help students find something that they can really sink their teeth into and really be motivated to learn, for sure. Okay, so let's finish up with some specific strategies or some approaches to cultivating agency. I want to really drill down here and maybe try to give listeners some practical examples, teachers you've worked with in the past or maybe are working with currently. Tell us about a few of those teachers and maybe yourself as well, what you have done or what other teachers have done who have been for you just kind of masterful at cultivating agency in the classroom. Some examples for listeners that they can take away and kind of think about.
Well, I think a few things that come to mind first is being a masterful person who asks questions and prompts and cues. I think as teachers, we tend to jump to direct explanation when kids have a question because we have this notion that I know and they don't, as opposed to saying they know or they have the resources to know. So if I answer this question, I'm actually disempowering them. I'm not building their skills of independence. I think that's a stance you have to take. You have to take a stance first as asking a question, then prompting them, like, where do you think you could find this answer for yourself? Who do you think you could ask? Which is really a question 3 in the PLC process type of question of building that self-resilience when you're stuck. And then, are you asking the right question and coaching kids on questions? The teachers who lean into agency, the thing they do first is they stop giving answers and they start asking really thoughtful and interesting questions that cause kids to change their approach. Now, initially it's frustrating, so be ready because kids they're used to you giving, they've been conditioned that the teacher has the answer. Right. And it's like, I call it Pavlovian, right? Ring the bell, you get the answer. And so we've done a lot of teacher observations where, we talk about wait time. The teacher asks a question, 2 seconds wait time, the teacher answers the question. That's very common. So that we have to stop that practice first. I'd say the second thing that I've seen teachers do really well is allowing kids to set their own goals and really getting kids good at goal setting around their learning. And I've seen it unit level, which is great, but a bit abstract. I see it most powerful when you do it daily. Kids come in, instead of having a warm up, what do you need to get done today in your learning? What is it going to look like at the end of the class period to have a successful learning day today? And then what are you going to do after this at the end, of reflection of saying, was today successful? What do you need to do before you come see me tomorrow? So getting them used to that metacognitive process of progress monitoring their own learning. And that you can do that whether you're doing lessons, you can be teaching very traditionally, and kids can still do that process of feeling like, okay, I get to know what I get control of what I do today. I get control of the efficiency of my time, and I get to control of how much time I get to spend out of work. Think about the old, okay, I'm gonna let you start your homework. You got 20 minutes, right? How many kids use that 20 minutes well, right? So and then they complain about their homework load. Like if you can get them just to think about that, then suddenly they're in control of how they use time, which seems more independent. It gives them more independence. I think in assessments, I think the biggest thing is, we have flipped something here at our school that we're purposely trying to do, is having kids reflect before seeking feedback, as opposed to reflecting on feedback. I think for years we've taught kids to reflect on our feedback. And again, that puts us in control of being the knower. And then you need to reflect on what I told you, which is still very valuable because we do know things and we are giving feedback on important things. But how about the kids saying, okay, based on the criteria, am I where I need to be? Oh, I'm not going to actually go to the teacher right now because I already know what I need to do next. And deconstructing that, I think, is a very powerful, quick flip strategy that I've seen teachers use that transforms their classroom. And I think finally, from a curriculum lens, the old anticipatory set, how can we turn that into a provocation? Something really interesting and authentic for kids that would inspire them in the learning today that relates to the standards. So I see teachers that are doing short 1-2 minute videos to start a class period. And then what questions do you have about this video? And then what do you think we're learning today? And just changing how we do anticipatory set for the TikTok generation, right? Because I think they need some of that inspiration to connect, like the why. These young, we hear about the millennials in the workplace now, and they always want to know why they're doing the work. Well, guess what? Your kids do too. So the more we can do that, the more they'll feel invested, and the more investment they have, the more they'll express their natural agency that they already possess.
Yeah, there's just so much there, Sascha. I just think there's so many ways that we can cultivate that. And I see a lot of overlap with assessment as well. You talked about asking questions. One of the most effective feedback strategies is asking, giving feedback in the form of a question or a cue or a prompt, getting the students to do the thinking, asking them questions about their learning and getting them to dig back into it. And there's also the piece around feedback that you talked about as well, which is that idea that we've been trained that feedback needs to be timely, needs to be immediate. But there's a lot to be said for, and I think research kind of supports this now, the emerging body, that delayed feedback, so that there's time for the student to reflect. There's time for them to think about their own learning before we pounce with our feedback. And I often say to folks, if we want students to be self-regulatory about their learning, we want them to cultivate their own ideas. If we keep pouncing with our feedback before they have that reflection time, then there is no space for them to kind of get messy with it. For some of our novice learners, maybe the feedback needs to be more immediate because we want to keep them on track. But as students gain proficiency, it's important that we give them the space to kind of reflect and to think about what their next steps are, to have that control in a way over where they're going. It is a fascinating topic and certainly something that is timely. And I know we've just kind of scratched the surface here.
Yep.
And certainly there's a lot to be said for digging deeper on these topics for sure. 2 questions left, Sascha, as we finish up today. And these are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. Here's the first one, and you can take this one in any direction that you wish. But educationally speaking, the question is, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think what keeps me up at night is whether we're preparing this next generation of super talented kids who have access to every piece of information in the world to address these complex problems that my generation's created, right? And I think that what we're seeing in the world right now is a lot of challenges, and those challenges are going to have to be solved. And I think we have the human capacity to solve them. But are we really preparing our kids to be creative and thoughtful and human? It sounds bad to say, but human. Are we willing? Are we able to connect? Are we making learning so much about stuff and not about the community? Again, I'll refer to my experience with the pandemic. I've always said that schools will never go away, as some people have predicted with technology, because learning is inherently social. But it's going to become a little bit more like church, right? It's going to become a place where we come to interact with ideas, interact with our ideas and our thinking. It's not going to be a place where we come to. If you're a person of faith, typically people of faith study, they pray, they do those things, but they go to church for a reason, and that's to commune. And school is going to be the same. So how do we get school to be more of that kind of place where we come together to talk about ideas, to gain perspective, say the crazy things that 20 people will push back on in a classroom Socratic seminar, right? So that's what keeps me up at night, is really that piece of are we preparing kids authentically for those challenges, and all kids. How much human capacity are we losing every year when kids drop out of school? And there's somebody in there that might have the answer to cancer, and we didn't find them because we lost them. So that really keeps me up.
Yeah, I absolutely love that notion of come to school to commune. I think that's a really brilliant way of looking at it. Last question is about success, about personal success, and just generally speaking about you as a human being. If a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, Sascha, what's your definition of success? How would you answer them?
Yeah. For me, I want to transform the educational system so every kid sees themselves in it and feels inspired to change their piece of the world. I think we put a lot of pressure on kids with authentic things to say, you got to solve, we have kids studying the UN Global Sustainability Goals. There's a lot of really smart people working on those things that are way more talented than our 5th graders. And yet we're putting all this pressure on these kids to solve these problems. Like I want them to have the efficacy that they can. So for me, it's really inspiring educators to see their kids differently, to see them as able, to see them as as something we're investing in and cultivating, as you've said that word a few times, and we're really growing them, we're nurturing them, but we're not creating them. They are, right? And so I think that's what success looks like for me.
Yeah, I love that. Again, I agree with that. And you've kind of altered my thinking on that. Not altered, but you've really brought to light this idea that they come to school with the agency. We just have to bring it out of them and provide them with the opportunities to show that. And are we making that kind of difference to them as we go along? Listeners, you definitely can and should connect with Sascha on social media. You'll find Sascha on Twitter. The handle is @Sascha_Heckmann. Sascha is also on LinkedIn. Just search Sascha Heckmann there. And you can also find information on the 8 Degrees Up website. That's www.8, the number 8, 8degreesup.com. Sascha, you've got a couple other things that you're on the go right now. I'm going to just throw it to you. I think you mentioned a couple things, Facebook, a book going on. What's happening?
Yeah, we're just launched a Facebook group called Amplifying Agency. We're finding a lot of educators trying these practices in their classroom, but feeling fairly isolated. So again, embracing your PLN, becoming part of a group of people who are trying to do the same thing and looking for those answers. Really, the PLC spirit. The answers among us if we ask the question. And then we're also writing a book of the same name to try to get those strategies that we started just touching the surface on, of how do you do this work, and which part of your existing practices will transfer and which parts kind of need maybe some rethinking. So we're excited. We hope to have that come out with solutions here in the near future, and that'll be exciting to kind of get out there and give feedback on. So we're looking to continue to contribute and collaborate around this work.
You definitely have a lot on the go, my friend, and certainly appreciate all that you do and the work that you do and the impact that you're having, quite literally, around the world. Sascha, it's great to reconnect with you. It's been a while, and really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. Thanks for doing this, man.
Thanks for having me. It's been great. A lot of fun.